Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Kiseitse, and the portion starts off with four different passages which the commentators tell us are related. The first one talks about when Jewish people go out to war, and an individual soldier has a desire, a passion for an Ashes Yifas Torah, for a beautiful woman who he takes captive. And the Torah says, even though normally this would be something which would be forbidden, the Talmud tells us, Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara. The Torah takes into consideration the passions that are happening when people are at war, and it allows you to take that woman forcibly as a wife. Again, it's not something which is promoted and something which we probably couldn't even imagine that we would allow in modern day warfare. But in ancient times, this was more the norm. And the fear was that if you said it's prohibited, it would be done anyway, and it may be done in a worse fashion that the Torah actually prescribes. Be that as it may, the next section talks about something else completely. It says when a man has two wives, which of course in biblical times you're allowed to have two wives. It says one is ahuva and one is snua, one is loved and one is hated. You have to make sure that the rule that a bachar, a firstborn, gets pishnayim, gets a double portion of inheritance has to be kept, and you can't favor the son of the wife that you love over the wife that you don't love. Now, this is something which really calls for a discussion, because when we know the story of Yaakov and his sons, he really did exactly that. He favored Yosef, and he made two tribes out of Yosef, who was the son of his loved wife, over the son of his hated wife, which was Leah. That's necessary for us to have a different discussion. The Torah here, though, says it's forbidden, and the commentators explain that why do you have a loved wife and a hated wife? So it could be that could just happen, or it might mean just in comparison, you have one that you favor over the one you don't favor. But they say that, this is an outcome of the previous passage. You take such a wife that you took when you were captive and you just lusted after her, that's going to be the one that is not your loved wife, it's the snua. And then what's going to happen is you're going to favor the other wife, and you're not going to give the proper inheritance to the son of the wife that you don't exactly love as much as the other wife. One thing leads to another, and then it says the next passage is if you have a ben saramor, a rebellious son, and again another strange passage, because it says if he's if he doesn't listen to the voice, to the authority of his parents, and even though after you discipline him he doesn't listen, so the parents should bring him to the Ziknei Ira, to the elders of the city, and they should say that this is a rebellious son, he's gluttonous, and he steals, and therefore we have to deal with him. And they stone him to death, which is a very strange thing because he didn't do anything which is a capital punishment. Again, here the commentators say two things. First of all, that it never happened. It's only sort of a symbolic story to tell you that, listen, this is what's going to happen if you raise a child like that. But whatever it is, it's saying that we judge him al shem sofa because of what's going to happen at the end. We see this is going to be a problem. He's going to be not only just not listening and not being disciplined, but rather someone who could be a robber, a thief, and perhaps even a murderer. And therefore, in order to avoid that, he's killed in advance. Again, a very difficult halacha to understand, but the commentators say this is a result of those two stories. You take a wife that's not proper, you then don't favor the right son, the son that deserves the inheritance, and then what you have is a sibling rivalry caused by not treating your children right, and you have a rebellious son who's going down the wrong path. Then the next section says, if you have a person who has a chet mishpat maves, that's somebody who deserves to die, he did something of a capital, something which deserves capital punishment. It doesn't say what it is, but let's just talk about a case of, for example, a murder. And it says the Bezdin, the court, executes him. You're not supposed to hang his body overnight. We show certain respect. But again, Rashi here says that this is a result of the previous story. If the parents don't discipline their child and they don't bring him to court and they don't deal with the issues, then eventually you're going to have a child who grows up into an adult who who does something which deserves the death penalty, and things just don't work out so well for this family. But what's the real sort of the upshot of everything that we're saying in this story is that sometimes there's unintended consequences for our actions. And although the Torah starts off with a story that we understand that human nature is such that we can't expect the ideal. And this is not only how the Torah, and perhaps even in the secular society, we understand that we have to give, give credence to people's natural urges. But when you do that, there are unintended consequences to your actions. You could rationalize, and we do this all in our own life without a court, without the Torah, without God telling us. We rationalize a lot of our acts. We do things that we say they're not right, but under the circumstances, I'm pressured, I'm under, it's a terrible situation. In this case, maybe we could be more lenient, and therefore maybe we take advantage of someone monetarily or even physically. Many, many things that we do because we rationalize. And the message here is that, yes, it might be even allowed technically. The rationalization might not be so crazy. And there is an understanding of human nature. But understand that when you do something, even something small, it could lead to something terrible. And that we have to realize that when at the end of the day, we end up with this child who ends up being a murderer. And it just reminds me of many of the times that they interview the mother or a father of a mass murderer, and they say, I don't know what happened. He was such a nice boy. And you sit there thinking, come on, how's that possible that you didn't see that this child was someone who was going to buy a submachine gun and mow down 10 or 20 people? It's just hard. It's hard to imagine. And again, the parents probably are somewhat innocent. They didn't necessarily raise a child to be a murderer. They weren't necessarily murderers, but they might have not disciplined properly. They might have maybe didn't treat that child properly. In other words, little things that they do that we all do in our life could lead to all kinds of happenings later on that we then say, oh, it's not our fault. How did this possibly happen? Why did God allow this to happen? And we have to realize that we are generally, not always, but generally the author of most of the mishaps that happen in our life. Again, not always, but just we should realize that we're responsible for our acts. And it's not only in a negative way, it's also in a positive way. You might help somebody once with a small favor. You might lend someone money when they're in need. You might do an act of charity. You might help someone off the street who needed help. And maybe later on in life, whether it's the next day, the next month, or 20 years later, you'll be in a similar situation where you'll need help. And people will remember not only that they want to be kind, but they remember this is a person who is kind to other people. How can we let that person, that man or woman, suffer? He or she did not let other people suffer. He or she was helpful to other people. This is what we owe them. Society, in a sense, owes them the kindness in return for the kindness that they did when they were in such a position maybe 10 or 20 years ago even. And those unintended consequences are sometimes really what is the driving force in our life. And we're in the month of Elul, the month before Rosh Hashanah, and we're going to stand in Shul on Rosh Hashanah and stand in a sense before God and ask for mercy. And one of the things we have to realize is that if you expect God to be merciful to you, if you expect to be treated kindly, you have to treat other people kindly. If you do, and it says that in some of our prayers, if we treated people kindly, then we could ask God to treat us kindly. If we treated people harshly, why do we expect that God should act any other way than we acted before? And hopefully we'll keep this in mind. And I always say this, Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Hadin, a day of judgment. And a lot of people are moved to do tshuva, to repent at the time of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But really, this is something we do all of our lives. We have to, all year. We always have to realize that everything that we do has consequences way beyond the small particular act that we do at that time. If we have that in mind, hopefully we'll all be zoch, we'll all merit to be judged kindly on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, on the Yom Hadin and the Day of Judgment. Good Shabbos.